So if it is not obvious, he's Thomas Haller and I'm Sushil Kulkarni. So before I start, I'd like to get a show of hands. How many of you have used Ansible for networking? Quite a few. The second question is, have you used roles that are available out there? Have you used any of those? Configuring. So good. Okay. So we want to introduce to you a role that we've developed, and the goal of this presentation is basically to give you an understanding of why we developed this role, and also hopefully by the end of this session, Thomas and I will have told you how you can use this role and you can effectively go and download the role and try it out for yourself. All right. There's some sound. All right. So why did we do this networking role module? So currently there are a lot of modules that exist. There's like interfaces file which you can use to directly configure your interface files in network scripts. There is an NMCLI module. There are these device-specific modules that are available. You can directly interface in. Is this sound? Sorry.
Okay, try.
Yeah. Just hold it up. It seems to do it without it. All right. So there are existing roles and modules that are available, but really our users came and told us, look, we really don't want to know intricate details of how to configure your systems. We don't want to know when you come across different releases, we don't want to change our front-end configuration models and stuff like that. So they said, give us a consistent way in which we can write something down and then it'll work across releases or across computing environments. So that's what we took from as feedback, and then we wanted to do this thing. So that's why we implemented it. We implemented this networking role and a networking module. What it does is basically it abstracts for you the networking configuration underneath, so the users can clearly write a single playbook and using the network role, and then basically run it across, and you'll still get the same seamless environment. That's the goal of the whole thing. Underneath, we'll talk a little bit about more what's happening, but for now, based on detection of the situation that you have, it'll either use network scripts or network manager, and we can extend it to other network providers if required. So, all right. So what's supported right now? So we released our first version a couple of months ago, and what's supported right now is we can do bonds, bridges, VLANs, teams, so you can kind of play around with it and kind of design your own network topology the way you want. Thomas will basically talk about and give you an example of how, how you can build a sample network, for example. All right. So the next one is basically I'm going to hand it over to Thomas. He's going to basically talk about setting up a simple and a complex situation.
Oh, okay, hello. So I will show you a few examples how to actually use this thing. And here we see a very first example. It is, well, it's quite trivial really. It defines a profile for Ethernet setup. And what we see, for example, this profile is tied to a particular device via its MAC address. And here it uses these Ansible host variables that are filled from this Ansible templating mechanism, how it can substitute the MAC address based from the variable in the inventory. So this profile applies to a particular device, and apart from that, there isn't much specified here. It doesn't specify any IP configuration. So by default, it will just use DHCP for IPv4 and do IPv6 auto configuration. So the whole idea is that you don't actually have to specify all this, and that there are a lot of defaults that just make sense. Of course, you can also specify something, like here, configure some static IP addresses. In this case, by default, DHCP will be disabled. But you could also, in addition to manual addressing, enable DHCP. We also see that IPv6 auto-configuration is disabled. And what we also see is that the previous example, there was a MAC address that it restricted the profile to be applicable only to a particular device based on the MAC address. And here it uses the interface name instead. When you run the role always tries to do as much validation as it can, that the configuration itself is consistent and it makes sense. That also means it will, if you specify here an interface name, it will check that such an interface with name ETH0 exists, and if not, it will fail early before actually modifying the system. You can override this check by say check iFace exists false. That would allow you to configure this profile without actually having a device with this particular name. Maybe later you won't be able to activate and use this profile, but maybe later on the device will be there. So I think what's also interesting is that there is this logical name. Within the role, you specify a list of profiles, and they all have a logical name here. It's called prod1 as example. That's not necessarily the interface name of this networking device where the profile later applies. It's more like an identifier within the role itself. Of course, they could be identical. So the name is important because if you have a layered example, maybe a bridge and a VLAN, then you start with like defining a profile for the bridge. Very simple here. We see it's a simple profile. It has type bridge, and it also specifies an interface name. It's a bit different than in the previous example where the interface name would restrict this profile to a particular device. Here, it's basically, it configures the name that this bridge will have. So that's a bit of difference that with these software devices, you would configure the name, not how it matches. So this is the bridge, the master device, and then later you also want a slave. You configure a profile for it, Ethernet in this case, and you see that there is here this master property, and this one references the profile, the bridge profile. Note that it references it by the logical name within the playbook itself. It's not necessarily the interface name or the MAC address of the master device. So, and finally, let's put the VLAN on top of that. You say type VLAN and specify VLAN ID, and it's essentially similar where you specify the underlying device via the parent property, again via this logical name. So the examples that we saw here, they have an implicit state present. It basically means if you run the playbook, then it will ensure that such a profile exists with this given configuration. The opposite is, of course, the state absent, which means to delete the profile if it's there and do nothing if it's not yet there. But as far as, for example, if the init scripts backend is used, then this state present and absent, it just means to write some files to disk. It doesn't actually change your networking configuration yet. So what you commonly want is that this configuration also takes effect. So there is this state up, which, you say make use of this. What we see here is that you cannot just say state up without also specifying the full profile. It means a state up always requires also state present together, because the profile might not be configured on this host. So you cannot just say state up without also specifying it. So this is a common thing, so you can combine these two and just define the profile and at the same time say that it should be up. In general, the role, it tries to be an abstract description of this networking configuration. It should describe just the state of what you want to reach on this host. This shouldn't be a series of steps that you need to take to make it happen. You should just describe declaratively what you want, and then it's going to make it happen. Now, with the present and absent state, that's quite clear what's happening. But with the up and down states, it's a bit more involved, because it basically corresponds to a call to if up, if down, or NMC-like connection up or down. So at this point, it kind of matters the order in which these steps are executed, because especially with init scripts, the role doesn't know the state of this machine, and init scripts doesn't know the state of the machine. So it really leaves the responsibility of get the order right to the user. That is a bit unfortunate, and probably something we want to improve in the future. But it's not so easy with init scripts, because you don't know what's the right order to call if up if you have multiple profiles, right? So, and with this, I give back to Sushil.
Okay. Like I was saying when I was talking about the initial slides, there's something that underneath that's happening behind the abstraction, and I just wanted to show you a little bit of what's happening in the back end there. So there's a concept of network providers that exists where you can choose whether you want to use init scripts or you can use network manager, or in the future we could add more providers that you can, like systemd, networkd. It's auto detectable right now, but you can also provide tags in your playbooks and kind of say, okay, this is what I want to use, this is what I want to use. So there's this facility for checking, so you can do a minus check, and it'll basically try to validate your inputs and see if your network configuration is going to be valid, because it can sometimes prove disastrous because you're trying to go over the network to configure a network, so you might screw things up. So you can do some checking in there. So if you look at this table, it's trying to give you, there are many more, but it's just high level view of things that happen under the covers when, let's say, when you have a role like Thomas was showing in the thing, like a name corresponds to a connection ID if network manager is used, and if init scripts is used, it's basically the config name, IF config file name. When you just say state up, it'll underneath call NMCLI connection ID up, which basically, and in terms of init script, it'll basically do an IF up. Same thing for appsline, it'll delete the connection or config file. If you want to do an auto connect kind of a thing, network manager will do the auto connect property, or the init script will do auto boot. Like I said, other providers are there. We're going to think about adding more providers in the future. So what's on the horizon? So you probably saw that Thomas was explaining this concept of connection profile based model here. There's another thought where maybe we should move away from it and try to have a model, a scheme rather, that can be generic, like how you can configure a router or another network device. So that's another thing that we're kind of trying to pursue to see if we can shift from this model to another generic model. So that's something we're talking about. We want to add more things. This is our first version that we created. So we want to add more interfaces. We want to add more networking features that we can support in RHEL or Fedora. Any other distribution which has like network manager and init scripts type networking present. The other thing that also we're trying to look at is to see if instead of Ansible, we can directly create like a module that we can run directly through other things other than Ansible, so that it's portable. You can reuse this across different environments. There's sometimes a requirement where some users are saying, look, I probably want to configure this thing, but maybe if something goes wrong, I want to go back to what was working before, because it's a network, so things can go bad. I mean, if you remove the connection, that's a different problem. But if an underlying network topology doesn't work for you, you want to roll back, you can do that. So we want to make that support available. Network Manager has something like that right now, and I think we'll probably look at to see how we can use that effectively for Ansible. And more logic to improve the declarative, I think like Thomas was talking about a little bit. So how can you basically get this role. You go to the Ansible Galaxy. This has been pushed to Ansible Galaxy, so you can do you get there. And also on the GitHub, it's available. So download it, try it out, and let us know what's missing and what you're looking for and what would you like to see. And of course, we're hiring. We always want to look for people. So if you want to interested in the networking group, because Thomas and me, we are part of the networking group. So if you are interested in networking, we're hiring. We're always there. And that's it. Do you have any questions for us? Yes.
How does the role work when you call it remotely? So I fire up a bunch of virtual machines, and then from my Ansible host, I go to these virtual machines that are DHCP addressed, and then configure the roles. But the problem is that the moment I do the up, I change the network configuration and break the connection to my Ansible host, and that one will simply stop because the machine just vanished.
Right. So just to repeat your question, how you're asking how you're going to manage Ansible on virtual machines, basically, where you actually know.
The remote usage of the role from a host, because the connection will break once I change the network.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was talking. If you change, you can add. But if you delete the connection that you're trying to do it, then obviously you got to find out another way to get into it and try to fix the problem that you had.
Can I answer this?
Yeah.
I think that is a problem, yes. So in general, just don't. Well, with Ansible, commonly you access the machine via SSH. So if you cut off your network, you have a problem. So what could you do about it? Well, the simplest thing is just don't do that. And with Ansible, what you can do is, like, for example, you can change the port of a SSH server, right? Which basically also involves that you do this async step, and then later you come back on another port. So that could also work. That is not yet implemented.
But the question was, can you do it that way that the role answers back, said, I did everything that you wanted to do, so the connection closes and the Ansible host goes to the next one in the loop of all the servers that I want to configure, and then it has some kind of a delay and applies the configuration after the connection to the control host has terminated.
Yes. So all these steps, you specify there are multiple profiles, like if you have a bridge, there are actually multiple steps involved, but this will all be executed by one module in one go, like in one transaction, you could say. So if you run it, it's supposed to get all the steps right, that at the end you are still reachable somewhere, maybe on another IP address. And then you can use this Ansible async feature, which is not yet implemented properly. But you would then say, okay, async, make it happen, and then later pull back until it's reachable on this other device. So that would be the solution. And another thing is, like, if something really goes wrong, that with this checkpoint feature of Network Manager, that it would basically, it creates a snapshot when it starts of its current configuration. It starts doing all the steps, and if you don't cancel this snapshot in a given timeout, then Network Manager itself will restore the previous configuration. But of course, all of this is, worst case, you have to go down to the server room.
Get the console. Yeah, no, it's not.
Throw away all the virtual machines and start from scratch.
Another question?
We have some plan to implement some generation of UDEF rules to set up a tool attributes parameters.
Sorry, could you repeat, please?
If you have some plan or plan to implement generation of UDEF rules to set up ETH tools or ETH tool parameters via UDEF.
Well, the question is whether there is a plan to write UDEF rules to use ETH, to set ETH tool parameters. Well, commonly, the backend currently is Network Manager and init scripts, and those already allow you to configure these layer 2 Ethernet properties, right? So
recommended, if init scripts, recommended now is to use UDEF rules. Not the ETH to variable in its requirement.
Right, but if you know there is no plan to do this, but also the problem is that UDEF rules only run once, right? So they do it when the device appears. So yes, in a very static setup, that is, but that is not really the model. If you have these profiles, then there is the idea that you activate one and then maybe another one. But UDEF rules only run once. So you have to apply these ETH tool settings when you activate the profile. Another question?